In the summer of 1937, a Louisville newspaperman ventured into Bleak Hollow. He carried a notebook and a pistol. Only one came back out. For nearly 200 years, Eastern Kentucky folk had whispered about Bleak Hollow and the Crole family bloodline within it. Not living as we understand it, but something older. Something that did not answer to sunrise. A name even preachers refused to speak. Before we dive in, press subscribe and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Bleak Hollow does not appear on modern topographical surveys. If you drive the 2-lane roads that curl through Letcher County, you will pass it without knowing. The old-timers say that was always the point. A hollow is a fold in the mountain, a place where the ridges close in, and the sun only touches the creek bed for a few hours a day. Most hollows have names because someone lived there once, and the name stuck. Bleak Hollow had a name because nobody wanted to. The first written record of the place comes from a Moravian missionary named Jonas Weller, who passed through the region in 1791. He wrote that the local Cherokee guides refused to accompany him past a certain stone outcropping, and that when he pressed one of them for a reason, the man told him only that the hollow had been closed off before any white man ever set foot on the mountain. Weller went in alone. He came out 3 days later with his hair completely white and a stutter that never left him. Weller would not speak of what he saw. Upon returning to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, he lived out the rest of his years copying scripture, and every letter of every word was written in a hand that trembled so badly the pages had to be redrafted by another brother before, or could be sent. Weller left behind exactly one written reference to Bleak Hollow in a private letter to his sister that was found among his effects after his death in 1817. He wrote that he had knelt to drink from a small pool near the mouth of a limestone cave, and that when he had raised his head from the water, he had seen his own face reflected in the pool, but the face had been smiling, and he had not been smiling himself. So he had run then, and had run for a great many hours, and had not stopped running until he was the hollow entirely. Even now, the letter continued, on some nights he still felt the pool watching him from wherever he happened to be sleeping. And it was the watching more than anything else that had cost him his sleep and his sanity, and eventually his voice. The Crole family arrived in the hollow in the autumn of 1798. There are no records of them coming from anywhere. No ship manifests. No tax rolls from any of the surrounding counties. No birth registers or marriage certificates in any parish, for 2 states in any direction. They simply appeared, a man and a woman, and what the neighbors down at the trading post called a child, though the child was said to be too tall for its age and would not speak when spoken to. The man gave his name as Ephraim Crole. The woman gave no name at all. When the postmaster at Whitesburg asked her, she smiled at him in a way that he later said made his gums ache, and she walked out without answering. That was the last time anyone at the post saw her face uncovered. From that day forward, the Crawley women wore veils of black horsehair that hung to the collarbone, and they never removed them in the presence of anyone from outside the hollow, not even when they were dying. A midwife from Hazard was called up to the hollow in 1804 to attend the birth of what would have been the second Crole child, and she returned to town in the small hours of the morning, with her apron soaked through, and her mouth set in a line that she did not open for 2 full days. When she finally spoke of it, she said only that the woman she had attended had refused to lift her veil even during the labor, and that when the child had been born, the child had made a sound that was not a cry. The midwife never worked again. She took her savings and moved to Ashland, and she died there in 1839, still unable to sleep in a room without a candle burning through the night. Ephraim Crole bought 40 acres of the hollow for 8 silver coins and a promise that the family would never seek to leave it. That promise was written into the deed by hand. The deed itself is still on file at the courthouse in Whitesburg, and any researcher can request to view it, though most do not linger over the second page. On the second page, in a script that does not match Ephraim's signature or the clerk's, someone has written a single sentence in Latin. It reads, translated, that the land was not sold, but returned. There is no record of who returned it or to whom. Within a generation, the Croles had grown. That word was chosen carefully by the people who lived nearby. They did not say the family had children. They said the family had grown, the way a fungus grows, the way a stain spreads across damp plaster. By 1830, there were said to be more than 20 of them living in the hollow, all sharing the same last name, all sharing the same too pale skin, and the same slow, deliberate way of walking. The census taker who came through in 1840 recorded only 4 names before he left the hollow. He wrote in the margin of his ledger that the rest would not give their ages, and that he did not feel it was worth his life to insist. He was found dead in his boarding house room in Prestonsburg the following week. The coroner ruled it a stroke. His widow said his hair had turned the color of ash overnight. What went on in Bleak Hollow was the subject of 200 years of rumor, and rumors in the mountains have a way of hardening into fact through sheer repetition. The Croles were said to keep no livestock, though smoke rose from their chimneys every night of the year. They were said to plant no crops, though the family grew and grew. They were said to hold gatherings on the new moon, and on those nights, the creek that ran out of the hollow would run red for a stretch of about a quarter mile before clearing again. Downstream farmers stopped letting their cattle drink from that creek entirely by about 1850. There was, before Hensley, another preacher who had tried. His name was Elias Marrowbone, a Methodist itinerant who rode through the region in the spring of 1854, and who was warned by his hosts in Whitesburg that a certain hollow was best left off his circuit. Marrowbone was a young man and a proud one, and he took the warning as a personal challenge. He rode up the hollow on a Sunday morning with his Bible in one hand and a wooden cross in the other, and he was seen from a distance by a farmer named Reuben Fields, who was working a field on the opposite ridge. Fields later gave a signed statement to the county sheriff. He said that Marrowbone had ridden up to the cabin and dismounted and began to preach at the top of his lungs to nobody visible, and that, after a few minutes, the door of the cabin had opened, and a figure had come out onto the porch, and the preacher had stopped his preaching mid-word. He said, the figure had not walked to the preacher. The preacher had walked to the figure. He had walked slowly and unwillingly, one step and then another, the way a man walks in a dream he cannot wake up from. And when he had reached the porch, the figure had taken the Bible from him and closed it and set it down very gently, and then had led the preacher inside. Marrowbone was never seen again. His horse wandered back to Whitesburg 3 days later. The cross was tied to the saddle horn with a strip of leather that had not come from any tack the animal had been wearing when it left. A Baptist circuit rider named Isaiah Hensley preached against the family from a pulpit in Blackie in the summer of 1867, and he named specific practices in his sermon that the local paper would not print. 3 nights later, his church burned to the ground with him inside it. The door had been barred from the outside with a length of iron chain, and the chain, when the ashes cooled, was found to be knotted in a pattern that no blacksmith in the county could reproduce. By the turn of the 20th century, the Crolles had achieved a kind of quiet notoriety across the whole of the Cumberland region. Children were warned about them, the way children in other places are warned about deep water or busy roads. Do not go up the hollow. Never answer if you hear your name called from the trees. Above all, do not accept anything a Crole offers you. Not food, not water, not shelter, not directions. The last rule was the most important. A traveler from Ohio named Samuel Barnhart got lost on the mountain in November of 1911 and stopped at what he thought was a farmhouse to ask the way back to the main road. He was found 6 months later by a hunting party. His body was intact. His eyes were not. The coroner said he had been dead a day or two at most, though he had been missing for 183 of them. Nobody could account for where he had been in the meantime, and nobody in the hollow admitted to having seen him. Which brings us to the summer of 1937 and to a man named Henry Adair. Adair was a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal, 32 years old. A veteran of the Great War, not a man who spooked easily. He had heard the stories about Bleak Hollow all his life, being from Pikeville originally, and he had decided that the Depression era was the right time to write the definitive account of the family. The Crole book, he thought, would do for that family what other reporters had done for the Hatfields and McCoys. There was a book in it, and he meant to have it. On the morning of July the 11th, he drove down from Louisville in a blue Ford coupe, checked into a boarding house in Whitesburg, and spent 3 days interviewing anyone in town who would speak to him. Almost nobody would. The ones who did asked him, over and over, not to go up the hollow himself. A blacksmith named Otis Combs told him that his own father had once been hired to shoe for a man from the hollow, and that the man had paid in coins that were not any currency Combs had ever seen, minted with letters that ran the wrong direction, and a face on the reverse that did not belong to any president or king that anyone in Whitesburg could identify. Combs had kept the coins in a jar on his mantle for 40 years, and he showed them to Adair, and Adair sketched one of them in the margin of his notebook. The sketch survives. Antiquarians who have examined it have not been able to place the design in any known tradition. The postmistress told Adair that mail addressed to the Hollow was never delivered because it was never claimed, and that she had once opened a letter that had come back undeliverable, and found inside it a photograph of herself as a child, a photograph she had never seen before, taken from an angle that suggested it had been shot through the window of her own bedroom. One old woman took his hands in hers and told him that whatever he found up there, he had to promise her he would not eat anything they gave him. He promised her because it was easy to promise, and because he did not intend to accept anything from the family in the first place. He drove up the mountain on the morning of July the 15th. What Adair found in the Hollow we know only from the notebook he was carrying when he was found. The notebook survived. Adair did not exactly. On the first page, he described the road narrowing into a rutted track, and the trees leaning in overhead so thickly that his headlights came on at midday. He described a smell that reminded him of the field hospital in France. Sweet and iron, and something else underneath. The cabin, he wrote, was unpainted, longer than it was wide, with no windows on the side facing the road. On the porch sat a man who did not stand when Adair approached, who only watched him from under the brim of a hat, and who, when Adair introduced himself, said in a voice like water over stone that the family had been expecting him for some time. Those were the exact words Adair wrote down. The family had been expecting him for some time. From that point onward, the notebook grows increasingly difficult to read. The handwriting changes. It becomes smaller and tighter, and begins to slope in the wrong direction, as if Adair were writing with his left hand, though he was known to be right-handed. He describes being led into the cabin. Inside was a long table, with more than a dozen people seated around it, all of them wearing the same expression, which was no expression at all. Veiled women stood behind the seated men, and in the center of the table sat a bowl covered with a cloth that was moving. He wrote the word moving 3 times. The walls of the cabin, according to his account, were not made of wood, but of something he could not identify. Something dark and warm to the touch that gave slightly under the pressure of his fingertips. A series of small alcoves had been cut into the far wall, and he listed the objects displayed in them in order: a wedding ring, a pair of eyeglasses, a locket with a lock of pale hair inside, a journalist's press pass. After seeing the press pass, he wrote nothing, except that he had understood in that moment that he had not been the first newspaperman to visit the Hollow, and that whatever list the family kept, he had already been added to it before he had come through the door. The next entries describe being asked to sit, then being asked if he was hungry. In his last legible sentence, he wrote that he had forgotten his promise to the old woman. After that, the notebook is only shapes, loops, and hooks, and long trailing lines that do not spell anything in any language. Adair was found on the morning of July the 18th, sitting upright behind the wheel of his blue Ford coupe, which had been parked neatly on the shoulder of the main road, about a mile below the mouth of the hollow. His notebook was on the passenger seat. His pistol was in his lap, unfired. He was alive. He was breathing. His eyes were open, and he was looking straight ahead through the windshield at nothing in particular. He would remain in that state for the next 41 years. In all that time, he never spoke again, and he blinked no more than once every few minutes. Adair was cared for in a state facility outside Lexington until his death in 1978, and throughout, the only sound he ever made was, according to one of his nurses, a quiet humming that she could not identify, and that sounded like more than one voice at once. The Crolles are said to still be in Bleak Hollow. A geological survey team went in during the autumn of 1994 to map some limestone caves in the area, and they reported no permanent structures, no farmland, no sign of habitation more recent than the ruins of a cabin foundation that they estimated was at least 100 years old. They also reported that 2 of their number refused to return to camp on the second night, insisting that they had seen figures standing among the trees on the far ridge, tall and thin and utterly still, and that the figures had been looking directly at them across a distance of nearly a mile. The team leader wrote in his official report that his men had been exhausted and were mistaken. In his personal journal, which was published after his death in 2006, he wrote that he had seen the figures too. He counted 11. For nearly an hour, he watched them before the light failed, and in all that time, not one had moved so much as a finger. The journal recorded that he thought about them every day for the rest of his life, and that the thing that troubled him most was not that they had been there, but that when the sun finally went down and he could no longer see them, he had the distinct impression that they had begun, slowly, to walk toward the camp. Nothing came of it. The team packed up before dawn and left. The hollow was not surveyed again. There have been, in the years since, other encounters that have never made the papers. A deer hunter from Hazard named Curtis Meade was tracking a buck through the ridges above Letcher County in the November of 2004 when he came. By his own account, upon a clearing he did not recognize on any map he owned. In the center of the clearing was a long wooden table, set for a meal, with places laid for what looked to be 12 or 14 diners. And the food on the table was steaming as if it had just been served. There was nobody there, Meade said. He stood at the edge of the clearing for perhaps a full minute before he understood what he was looking at, and that when he understood, he turned and walked out of the trees without hurrying, because he had the strong impression that hurrying would be a mistake. He drove home that afternoon and put his rifle in the closet and never hunted again. He told his wife about the clearing exactly once. She told a friend at church, who told a cousin who told me. Meade himself passed away in the winter of 2019. When his family cleaned out his effects, they found a small wooden carving in the drawer of his bedside table, an animal shape they did not recognize, folded from what appeared to be an old banknote. They do not know when he acquired it, or from whom or why he kept it hidden. To this day, the land is still on the tax rolls in Letcher County under the name Crole, and the taxes are paid every year in cash, delivered in an envelope to the courthouse by a courier who does not give his name and who is never the same person twice. The clerks who have received these envelopes over the years have all noted the same detail. The bills inside are always old. Some are older than the clerks themselves. Some are older than the courthouse. And every year, without fail, one of the bills in the envelope is folded into the shape of a small, precise animal and left tucked in among the others as if by way of a signature. Whatever the Croles were, whatever they still are, they have not left the hollow. And if the stories are true, and the ledgers are true, and Henry Adair's notebook is true, then the promise, Ephraim Crole, made in 1798, has never been broken. The family has never sought to leave. It has never needed to. The mountain feeds them. The mountain hides them. And on the new moon, when the creek runs red for a quarter mile before clearing, the mountain still remembers what it agreed to return. Some things in the hills of Kentucky are not meant to be recorded. Certain places are not meant to be surveyed, and a few families, it seems, are not meant to be counted. The Croles of Bleak Hollow are, by any reasonable measure, a piece of Appalachian folklore, a story told to frighten children on porches after dark, a legend passed down from grandparents who half believed it themselves. That is the reasonable measure. But reason has a poor track record in that part of the country, and the mountain, as any local will tell you, keeps its own counsel. If you ever find yourself driving the back roads of Letcher County after sundown, and you see a rutted track leading up between two ridges where no track ought to be, do the thing that Henry Adair did not do. Keep driving. Do not stop. Do not answer if you hear your name. And whatever you do, do not accept what is offered.